The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
I'm Gerald Stulc. I was a physician, a surgeon. My specialty was cancer surgery, and I also served 16 years as a flight surgeon in the U.S. Navy and reserves. And I've had a passion lifelong for the history of medicine as well as the history of military, all things military. And so I combined that passion after I retired as a surgeon. I got my MFA in creative writing, and I started writing several books at the same time, just a type A personality. And one of these that just came out last summer was The Surgeon's Mate. And this is a historical fiction novel set during the Napoleonic Wars. And I'm here to tell you that I don't believe there is any such thing as historical fiction. It's neither historical nor fiction. And I'll tell you why I believe that. First of all, history. History is a living thing. We are history right this very moment, right this very day. History is occurring. History is not dead, as William Faulkner famously said in Requiem for a Nun. History is not in the past. It's not dead. It's not even past. And I lived down south for 25 years, and the Southerners truly, has anyone here ever lived in the South? The Southerners truly believe that their history is not past. It lives with them. I'll come and have dinner with somebody, and in their dining room they'll have a picture from before the Civil War, antebellum South, and that'll be Uncle so-and-so, and they'll be talking about him like he had just visited yesterday, and yet, you know, the painting's from 1855. The history is very much alive down south with these people. And in that way, as William Faulkner said, the past is never dead. It's not even past. It's living with us right now. We're the product of that history. Tomorrow will be the product of what we're doing today. So I don't believe that history really is past. When you write historical fiction, even though it's historical, people's behaviors, people's needs, compassions never change. You go back 50,000 years ago to some society, what will be the needs of the people that you can talk to, assuming you can talk to them? They'll be worried about their kids. They'll be worried about where their next meal is coming from. They'll be worried about protection and defense. They'll be worried about love, hate of somebody. The same emotions, the same needs we have currently. So when you write a historical fiction novel, it resonates with the reader because it addresses common themes. It addresses the human condition, something that's relevant to all of us, no matter the place or the time. Now, certainly you'll say, well, you can't compare a Roman citizen 2,000 years ago to what we're undergoing now. Not specifically. Certainly laws change, customs change, clothing changes, food changes, tastes change. They can change almost from day to day. But the basics are always going to be there. You can always relate to somebody. And that's why when you write historical fiction, you want to be able to address that commonality between all of us, between you and me, and between our ancestors. I'm giving an evolution course starting next week at Empire State. I want to show you how we relate to all the creatures around us, all the living things. My little dog, Mr. Beasley, a Shih Tzu, is waiting for me in the car. He's probably taking a nap now. We relate to each other. We have the same basic needs: sleep, eating, comfort, love. And these things you have to be able to put into a historical fiction novel so that it relates to you. Yet, if you go too far, then you're going to miss out on what makes this situation particular. For instance, my hero here on the cover, and my wife picked out this picture for the cover. She said, "Oh, he's handsome." And I said, "Like me?" And she said, "No." So his name is Jack Swift. He's a young man who was born in France. His family made him escape to England when he was a young boy, a child actually, to escape the Great Terror, the French Revolution. So he grows up as an orphan in England, and he becomes assigned to Her Majesty's Navy, or His Majesty's Navy as it was at that time. And he becomes a lob-lolly boy, which is a surgeon's mate, what we call now a medic or a corpsman in the Army or Navy. Anybody here been in the military? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. Great, great people. In fact, this morning when I was reading this one oral history of this fellow, he was in Europe around Bastogne, Battle of the Bulge, and he was a medic, and his medical corps of 180 medics had 80% casualty rate. 80%. Because they went out there and they risked their lives to bring back people and save them. So he was a loblolly boy. And loblolly is a kind of porridge that they would make up on board the ship and serve the sick and the injured while they're recovering. And so they'd bring this porridge, these bowls of loblolly porridge to all the sick that were steered away in the lower holds of the ship while they were recovering. And so they became known as loblolly boys. Now these folks had no training like medics or corpsmen have now. So he was a very lowly loblolly boy, or a surgeon's mate as they became known. And they didn't even have rank. I'm going to be speaking at Annapolis in September, presenting a paper at the McMullen Symposium that deals with naval history. And I'm going to be talking about the reforms that happened about this time in the British Navy, where surgeons finally got a rank, because they weren't officers. Even though they're in the Navy, they weren't given an officer's rank, and they weren't even paid as much as Army surgeons, which would really, really get their goat. So a lot of things were happening at this time. Besides, they were, just like Hitler, they were threatened by an invasion by Napoleon from France. And so there was this mighty struggle in October 15th, 1805, called the Battle of Trafalgar. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It had to do with Lord Nelson, Admiral Nelson, the fellow with the one eye and the one arm, who led the battle against the French and Spanish forces that were going to try and drive out the English from the English Channel so Napoleon could bring his barges, his fleets of men to invade England. So England, this was like the Battle of Britain. They were being threatened with invasion, and the first step was to wipe out their fleet so that Napoleon could bring his troops over. This is a seminal battle, and this is the way the book starts out. And I read, before I wrote this, a number of personal accounts from the people that were in that battle. So I'm giving a realistic view here of what it was like to be on board the Victory, which was Nelson's flagship, which led the charge right into the Spanish and French fleet. And I give these accounts from what I read these people went through, including a couple of the surgeons that were on board and took care of Nelson when he was shot and killed by a sniper during the battle. So this is all extremely authentic. Now, what makes this even more authentic, frankly, is that not only have I studied military history all my life, I've lived it for 16 years, and I was a surgeon, and everything I describe in here, which can frankly be quite graphic at times, I've seen myself. None of this is made up. It's not like so many writers, when they write something medical, they go to their local doctor and they say, oh, by the way, if I got a gash on my leg, you know, what would it be like? How would you treat it? And the doctor says, geez, I don't know, I'm not a surgeon, but I guess I'd do it this way or that way. What would it look like? Bad. Well, I've seen it. I can describe it. And what is in here is absolutely accurate, militarily, historically, and medically. The other point, too, is that I've done so much research. If anyone writes a historical fiction novel, and the best historical fiction novels are the ones not only that relate to you and me on the common ground of being human beings and having the same needs, but also getting down to the details. Because, as I said, even though the history resonates with us and is part of us now, none of us here are dressed like they dressed 200 years ago. All of us hopefully brushed our teeth this morning. Many of them probably didn't. so forth and so forth. I get down to where even I found out what the popular color was for 1805 for women's dresses, and it was called a Mazarin blue. And when he meets this fellow spy, and I won't get into that, but the good part starts in page 104, she is wearing slippers made of Mazarin blue on the way to a party. And she says, this is the latest color. And indeed it is, because I looked it up, and I looked up the papers from that time, and indeed the color for that year was Mazarin blue, kind of almost like the seats you're sitting on. So you have to be accurate. And believe me, some people that really get into the historical fiction novels will write back to the author saying, those kind of buttons didn't come till 5 years later. And you wrote in your book that they buttoned up with this kind of button, and it didn't exist then. Okay, fine. So some people really get into this. But still, you have to be accurate enough to give a similitude so you feel like you have resonance. You feel for this person, or you really hate that person, but you have some kind of feeling towards that person, good or bad. That's number one. But number two is you should be able to put yourself into their position. Let's say a Nazi sympathizer in France during World War II, an odious person, and yet the writer may want to show you the other side, why they're collaborating with the Nazis. I just read last night that Coco Chanel, you've heard of her? She was a spy for the Nazis. She collaborated with them. And Winston Churchill, who was a friend, hushed it up after the Second World War. She was going to be arrested for her collaboration, and Winston Churchill put a damper on it. So all these kinds of things, but where was her mind? Where did she come from? She obviously felt it was justified to collaborate with a horrible, horrible regime. So it's putting people in a particular perspective that you can at least appreciate, if not agree with. So with historical fiction, the same thing. Putting them into the position where you can at least see where they're coming from, which would be mildly different from where we are now. Obviously, none of us are going to be on a sailing ship of 800 men facing a French or Spanish fleet. That's never going to happen. But I want to present it in such a way that you can feel like you're there, like it's possible that you could feel the same things they're feeling at that very moment, which would be mainly fear, of course. But nonetheless, that part has to be historically accurate and historical enough where you are transported to another place. Because all of fiction, even nonfiction, if you're reading, let's say, a biography of Winston Churchill, you want to be able to place yourself what it was like to be standing in front of Parliament, arguing not to give in to the Nazis, making that famous speech. Any of you seen The Darkest Hour, that movie? Wonderful movie, I thought, where Churchill is resisting everybody's efforts to try and conciliate the Germans and come to some kind of a truce agreement with them. And Churchill said, no, we will never do that. We'll fight on the beaches. We will fight on, and so forth. And you want to be able to be placed into that milieu. Now, the other thing is the fiction part. If you're writing fiction, it's still not fiction. Because unless you're really basing it on a particular person or on a particular event, it's not really fiction. The fiction comes in that you are filling in the gaps that we can't possibly know now. So 95% of the historical fiction book here is absolute non-fiction. The majority of the characters in the book really existed. Now, certain conversations I've had to make up because God knows nobody was there to listen or record it. And yet I go by what I've read, the way they would have spoken to each other, the kind of subject, topics that they would have discussed. And that you simply have to make up, but try and make it as realistic as possible and also congruent with the characters and the time and place. So you want to be able to do that. But otherwise, most of this is non-fiction. The events all happened. Only the main characters, the hero and heroine, and yes, he does find true love, are made up, but they're made up based on people that would have lived at that time. Everything else, all the events, everything else is nonfiction. So much for historical and so much for fiction. So this really is a good slice of history that's pertinent to us now, because we may not have existed as we are. We may have been speaking French if they lost the Battle of Trafalgar against the French and Spanish in 1805. So it is historical to a point, but it resonates and is pertinent to us even now, even though we may not know it. And secondly, it's not fiction, because most of this is nonfiction. It's all based on fact. And I'm playing around within that reality to give you a darn good story, in my opinion. I'm waiting for a Kirkus review. I'm praying that it's going to be a good one. But it's so far it's been very popular. You can look it up on Amazon, some of the reviews. And at this point, I'm not going to babble any further. I'd like to open it up for any questions or discussion.
Did you spell surgeon a different way on the book?
Yes. Yes. I'm sorry? Yes. Did I purposely misspell surgeon's maid? Yes, this is the old version, because if you read the book, you'll find out within several pages that it's based on a book written 200 years before this, back in the 1600s, by a fellow named John Woodall, who was a Navy surgeon back in the 1600s, who wrote a book called The Surgeon's Maid, and surgeon was spelled that way in the past. And so I'm going from there. So that not only are we reading about what happened 200 years ago in the book, he's telling us what happened 200 years before him, 400 years ago. So, and besides, it has several meanings, because he truly finds his mate in the book. It's a great love story. 104, that's where it gets good. Yeah, yes, sir.
About the death of Nelson at Trafalgar, I believe he was shot in the spine, is that correct?
Yes and no, yes. Yeah, it was a sniper from the Redoutable, the French ship, and they collided side by side, smashed together, and the snipers were up in the mast, the netting, the crow's nest, and the sniper fired down on him, hit him right next to his epaulette on his left shoulder. It went into what we call the supraclavicular fossa and bored its way down obliquely through his spine, so that he was paralyzed from the waist down. And collapsed lung, bleeding into his lung, didn't hit any major vessels, or else he would have died almost within, well, minutes, if not immediately. So he survived about 4 hours in excruciating pain, because his back was broken, shot through. And he lived long enough to find out that the British had won. And he said, "Thank God I've done my duty," and then he expired.
Now, with modern naval medicine, would that be such that he could have survived the battle and come home, or would he have expired?
Well, if he would have gotten immediate, yes. If he had sustained that injury nowadays on board a ship, would he have survived and come home? If there was immediate medical attention, which there most likely would have been, because every ship now has an operating room on it, and the carriers have a great operating rooms, several sets of operating rooms in them. And I got to tell you a story after that. Basically, if they would have got him right to the OR, put a chest tube in, drained, and blown up his lung against, even possibly operate on if necessary. I don't know how bad the bleeding was at that point, but they could have resuscitated him. Regardless, he would have been paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. It would have not been a happy picture for him. I've met a number of vets like that coming back from Iraq, Afghanistan, paralyzed from the waist down. I met a fellow who was paralyzed from the waist down and had only one arm. Both his legs and the other arm were gone. This was done at Bamsey Brook Army Medical Center when I was down there 2 years ago to interview the doctors and vets down there for my other book. This fellow was able to have children afterwards, had twins, because they collected the sperm from him, you know, inseminated his wife that way. Yes, sir. Yes. Oh,
Without being too graphic, you've said many times in your book you've seen, well, everything that you describe in the book, even though it was 1805. What are some of those things?
amputations, the most common thing. Amputations. God, I've done a couple of hundred at least amputations. And nobody describes it correctly except me, I'm sorry to say, but it's true. When you cut the muscle with a knife, and I don't want to get graphic here, but the muscles wiggle. From the stimulus of the knife, they actually wiggle. And I mentioned that. Head wounds, chest wounds, fractures, you name it. Yeah. And, well, I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it up to you to read then. Yes, sir.
What would you say was the most challenging part of writing your book, this particular book?
The revisions. I wrote this thing in several months. I mean, it was just such a passion. I'd even stay up at night, not able to get to sleep, thinking, what would they do? Because the characters take over for you. You can do an outline. I know, I can't think of his name now, John Grisham. And he told me that he writes this huge outline on legal paper, because he's a lawyer, of course. I lived down in Jackson, Mississippi at the time, and he came down for a talk. And he writes everything out longhand on legal paper, but then he scraps it, because once the book gets going, the characters take over. Every author will tell you this. They have this great plan in mind, and yet they start writing, and the character somewhere deep within you says, I wouldn't do that. I'm not going to do that. Or I would do this instead. And you got to listen to them, because they're right and you're wrong. So whatever outline you do, you have to just go by your intuition. What the Greeks rightly called the muse, this goddess that comes down, sits on your shoulder, and whispers to you what you have to write. Not what you want to write, but what you have to write. And I love that. Every author will tell you that the characters take over for them. They don't write the book. Something else, somebody else, the muse, the characters, they write the book for you. So the hardest part, I think, though, was the revision part, because it took me 4 months to write it and about 5 years to do the revisions. 95% of writing is revision. And I liken it to, you try and make, is your wife here or friends? Or if somebody was going to make a bust of your head out of clay, they'd start with a big lump of clay, and they just start smacking things and pinching things off. In the first couple of days, you wouldn't know what the heck it was. And you have to keep going over and over and over and over till you get it just right. And that's the way it is with a book. You keep polishing it. You keep adding and removing things, most of the time removing things, until you finally get it the way you want. And I've had friends, authors, who even after their book was published would be sitting there and writing in corrections into their book even after it was published, because it's never right. It's never right. Some point you just got to say, that's it, it's finished, I got to get it out, go on with the next project. The hardest thing is the revision. The ideas, I never had mental block, writer's block, anything like that. And I wanted to tell you, too, about the, I showed my mother, who, God bless her, just lives up the road here at a nursing facility. She's 95. And I showed her some photographs of operating rooms below decks on an aircraft carrier that I visited in San Diego after I had retired from the Navy. And inside, for the visitors, they had these mannequins dressed up as surgeons, and a mannequin on the table lying there. And just to show you what it would have looked like during an operation at sea. And my mother said, is that you? Are you one of those? I said, no, Mom, that's a dummy. And she looked like, well. Any other questions? Or?
I have another one.
Sure.
Other than your book, what do you consider some of the best examples of historical fiction?
Oh, gosh. Oh, you got me here, because I can remember the books. I can't remember the authors. But there's this woman who wrote, My Name is, and I can't, yes. Yeah, Olivet, is it Mary? Oliver.
My name is Mary Suter.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, and even then, she doesn't get it right medically. She made a couple of boo-boos, but I think she's wonderful. That's just an example. Yes, ma'am.
What about Patricia Cornwall?
I haven't read much, but I liked what I've read. I've liked what I've read. There are a number of fabulous people out there. There was an Australian author, about 20 years ago, who wrote things about the Roman Empire. And I can't remember her name either, but she wrote some wonderful books.
Colleen McCall.
Yes, thank you.
Why?
Yeah, I guess you work in a library, huh? My mind's going in 1,000 different directions. I can't keep up with it. Yes, sir. Well, you know, I got an issue with him. He did wonderful research, but I think he's long-winded. There's one book he wrote where he wrote it all in the idiom, the dialect of these people from a particular area of Ireland and Scotland, and it's unreadable. You can't understand it. And that's one of the first things we learned in creative writing, is that you never write in idiom, particularly in this age when it could be considered derogatory or condescending, but especially because people aren't going to understand it. And this whole book, I tried to read and I couldn't understand it. Master and Commander, he goes on and on and on, 15 pages describing all the different parts of the ship, the rigging and everything, and you just kind of want to yawn after a while. I mean, great, you know the stuff, but you know, give us a story too. Wonderful stories, wonderful stories. I just don't like the way he writes them. My opinion. But yeah, I mean, he's great. I just don't like the way he writes the stuff. Yes. Oh God, I grew up on him. Yeah. Yeah. And was it one of the great actors that played Horatio Hornblower in a movie? Gregory Peck. Thank you. See, I'm old enough to remember him. Anything else? Gee, stop by, talk with me. I'll be at Northshire next month if I get to remember it. I can just see getting a phone call from up there. Where are you? But basically that's it. I am actually writing a sequel to this already, and some people are pushing me along to get it finished, but it's going to take several years to finish. You know, you just can't produce something like this overnight. If you do, you're like Patterson, who has 25 people, you know, pounding away at typewriters and computers, coming up with all kinds of crap. I want to write something of quality, frankly. Well,
No more questions?
sure, yeah.
Can you make a comparison of today versus then in your historical fiction novel, rather, of how they handled shock when they did amputations?
Yeah, great. Well, actually, and I gave a talk on that last year in San Antonio on World War I, because it was in World War I where they finally addressed, she talked about shock back then versus now, how you treat it. It was only in the First World War that they began to understand what shock was all about. Before then, shock comes from the French word, and I'm trying to think of the onomatopoeia, I guess it would be called, because back in the 18th century, they described a condition where somebody would be hit with a musket ball in the flesh, and to their ears, it sounded like shock. And so they came up with this term, the syndrome of shock, where somebody was badly injured by a musket ball, usually, and they would start to lose consciousness. They would start to become delirious. Their urine output would go down. You could barely feel their pulse. They would become cold and sweaty. And 9 times out of 10, they would go on to die. And that syndrome became known as the shock syndrome. Well, by the 19th century, and I don't want to give you a medical history lecture, but I will, so to heck with it. Galvani began to experiment with electricity because they began to discover electricity in these little glass jars and stuff. And you put these wires from this glass battery jar to a dead frog's leg, it would start twitching. And then you do it to cadavers, and the cadavers would lie there, and all of a sudden they'd sit up, and everybody would go, ah! And that, in part, led to Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein using the electricity. So the whole idea of body humors began to change in the 19th century. Disease was not caused by body humors being in balance, but by neuroexcitability. That was a new phraseology, that either your nerves were too excited or weren't excited enough. And some people came up with long lists of which diseases were caused by too much nerve excitability and which were not caused by enough. And all through the 19th century, you'll see all these gizmos where people would be hooked up to electrodes, and guy would spin the gears, and they get these shocks, and they say, oh, I feel better now, thank you. And of course, this devolved finally into electroshock therapy, which is a reasonable course of therapy for severe depression. But the whole idea of neuroexcitability is, obsolete, to say the least, absurd. So I'm getting right to answering your question. I'm sorry. I know, and here I'm going on, and you got other things to do. They didn't, because even in the First World War, they didn't know what caused shock. They didn't know how to prevent it. Now, somebody came up with a bright idea to give them a lot of fluids, what we call IVs now. They use these glass tubes and then these silver needles that they jab in and start dripping in saline, thinking that they're dehydrated. They were. People back then thought that it was, again, a paralyzing of the nervous system from the wound that caused the shock, the blood pressure to go down, pulse rate to go up, everything else, and death to ensue. Going back to that neuroexcitability, back still 100 years ago, they thought that shock was caused by nerves being overly stimulated and causing all this. Well, it was as the war went on and they began to give blood transfusions, which is a whole different story, and these saline infusions by IV, that they came to realize, gee, maybe replacing the blood they've lost has something to do with it. It was only in this experiments by Cannon, a famous physiologist in 1922, that he finally said shock is simply losing too much blood, period. And now we have several different class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4 shock, depending how many units of blood you lost. 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 cc's of blood, and et cetera, and we know, and research is still going on, but we know so much about what causes shock because it sets off a whole bunch of chemical alarms in the body that instead of helping you, actually push you over the edge into the coffin. So that shock. So how would we have treated it now? Blood transfusions were experimenting with different kinds of chemicals to reverse shock. Back then, they didn't know what caused it. They were helpless. They just knew it existed, but they were helpless to treat it. Now, they did use tourniquets to stop the blood flow. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Delete that knowledge from your mind when you
Absolutely. Absolutely. I cannot use certain words. Do I have to delete certain words or ideas when I write a kind of book like this? Absolutely. You'll catch yourself using phrases that they didn't use back then. And what I found very helpful was not only to read a bunch of the primary material, the actual original material from that time, so I could get kind of a feeling for their kind of language, and I tried to simulate it here, but if I was to do it absolutely the way they talked, it would sound like Jane Austen, and to some extent it would be difficult reading because it would be too formal. So I try and put kind of a balance in it, but I've got this wonderful set of encyclopedias. It's called Samuel Johnson's Dictionary from 1756. It was the first major English dictionary, and I have a copy of it at home. And I go through that, and I try and find words that they would have used that are now obsolete, like vacuary. Do you know what a vacuary is? I think it's a lovely word. It's a cow pasture. Because vaca, Latin for cow, vacuary. A sanctuary for cows. Isn't that sweet? How would you like to come to my vacuary?
Could you tell us some of the story in your book?
Sure. Okay. And I don't want to, give away everything, but basically, this young fellow, he's 17, 18. I'll leave that up to you, because a good writer has to leave enough up to your imagination for you to fill in the blanks the way you want to fill them in, so that you can relate to it. If I write every detail out for you, yeah, okay, fine, you're going to lose interest. So I won't tell you his age, but he's young. He's young, he's callow, inexperienced in many fields in life, and he becomes experienced, page 104, and he has this ambition because he comes from noble blood, French blood. And he's just got this burning ambition, and yet all he is this lowly loblolly boy who's just ordered around like he was, a street sweeper or something. And he aims for more. The fleet goes to Gibraltar, which was occupied by the English, right after the battle to take care of their sick, and they have a big hospital in Gibraltar. And all these wounded are there, including French prisoners. And because he speaks French fluently, he's sent there to take care of the French prisoners. Give them the loblolly, change their dressings, adjust their pillows for them, glorified kind of a nurse. But he begins to hear all this important information as they talk to him. The Admiralty, which is like the Department of the Navy for England, thinks, maybe we could use him. And they send him to France as a spy. And he's terrified, of course. Doesn't know what the heck he's doing. He's dressed up as a French dragoon, which is a military soldier on horseback with a helmet and long plume down the back. And he's sent there as a dragoon messenger. And they give him training and all this before he goes, which is also fascinating. He gets fencing lessons, and I was on the fencing team at Cornell, so I know all about fencing. So you write about what you know. So I put that stuff in there, how he's trained, quatre, pare, and all this stuff, octava. And he's sent there, still absolutely scared to death. And he meets his true love, and then he gets caught up in Napoleon's war on the continent, the land war, and he can't get out. And he becomes a surgeon in the French army, whether he likes it or not, and along with his beloved, and they're trying to figure out a way to get the heck out of Europe and back to England. And I'll leave it at that. But there is a sequel, so you know that they make it. But the page 104. In the paperback, it's page 102. For some reason, it's a different page.
There's no more questions.
Thank you for staying. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.